Demikila, hi. Yes, I mean, this budget, looking at it, is really indeed a budget that portrayed that government was serious about business here. I mean, that's the feeling we're getting from analysts across the board here, that it does look like a convincing budget speech this afternoon. Of course, we have things like the debt to GDP still approaching 70% over the next 2 or 3 years, but there was some good things about spending and cutting spending. I'm going to bring in Daniel Silk here very quickly, the analyst on the political economy. Was this a convincing speech? I mean, does government have a hold now on what it has to do in terms of reducing its spending?
Well, I think convincing we will know over time. I think what it was a realistic assessment, at least the beginnings of a realistic assessment of some of the urgent priorities for government. And the big take-home from this really is the issue of cutting back state expenditure and realistically now looking as though government is serious about putting its battles with the unions to a side for the moment and attempting now to process 160 billion rand in salary adjustments downwards for the public sector wage bill. I mean, that is a significant step for government. It's a significant financial and political step now for the Minister of Finance to begin a process of negotiating with the unions. And on that basis, I think it is something more unusual. We haven't quite seen government willing to really take the battle to its key alliance partners, particularly the trade unions. And no doubt the big question will be over the next few months as to whether this 160 billion rand cuts will indeed be accepted by the unions and what kind of disruptions we could have as a result of that. But there are other issues. There's no tax for South Africans, no personal tax increases, no VAT increase. And for the first time, I think in many budgets, government is finally understanding that you cannot continue to raise taxes and expect your revenue to be raised as well. We've seen the more you raise taxes, the less government collects in its revenue, and we saw dramatic reductions in revenue collections announced this afternoon. And I think that will act as something of a relief for the average South African, for the poorer and middle class South African who has been extremely cash strapped over the last while. So I think it's an important step in the sort of very slow process of rectifying where we've been in South Africa. But the old saying, the proof will be in the pudding, still remains. And exactly how we deal with this mushrooming debt, the question still remains. And what do we do about the 450 billion rand that is still Eskom's big debt and the biggest issue for us in South Africa? These issues haven't really been addressed in the budget.
I'm going to get to SOEs in a moment, but let's bring it back to investor confidence here. So I was tracking the rand as the minister spoke, and Daniel, just an hour ago, or an hour and a half when we were talking, we saw that rand sitting at 15.32, roundabout there to the US dollar. We get into the budget speech, it drops by about 15 to 16 cents, now sitting at 15.15. I understand the coronavirus would have always had volatility, but can we say, at least as a knee-jerk, investors like this speech purely on the basis of that rand strengthening, or is that too much?
Look, it is a difficult period given the coronavirus and the fleeing from risk for many investors, and I do think that we would expect a fair amount of volatility in the currency today because of the global factors and because of the budget speech. But I think the spending cuts announced are serious, and I think their magnitude is big enough to give some encouragement to the investor community and, for that matter, perhaps even to the rating agencies watching this, that there is at last a degree of seriousness about what the government intends to do. And on the basis of that, I think that it is a budget, broadly speaking, to be welcomed. The rand itself is going to remain, I believe, extremely volatile over the next short to medium term as well. And the global issues may well, in fact, impact the rand even more than this budget. There are far too many still unanswered questions emanating from the budget today. But the overall message from government is a sense of urgency, and I think this large figure certainly indicates that government here is not playing around anymore, it's serious.
So you had organizations like Business Leadership South Africa, you had BUSA, another business unit, you had the Minerals Council saying, look, the best way to actually get money coming into this country is to increase economic activity. Watch out for that corporate tax, that if you rise that, it might just limit competitiveness. And I see there are moves to actually see that corporate tax coming down. And the other point, Daniel, that struck me is that 2.5 billion rand will be going towards the fund for the NPA and other investigative tasks. Fighting corruption is a big investment concern, and that's a a positive, I would think.
There's no doubt that the additional money for the Hawks and for the NPA are vital. It's going to have 800 new prosecutors available. It must send a shiver through the backs of those sitting in Parliament who may well be implicated in future, and I think that's a real positive. One of the issues we know about South Africa and about the investigation into state capture is the incapacity or the undercapacity of the NPA to prosecute. And I think this is a very important issue for all South Africans worried about what's gone on in the last decade or so. But clearly, foreign investors are going to be looking for consistency. They're going to be looking for a message. And I think they probably will have found a fair amount to be positive about in this budget this afternoon. From a tax perspective, domestically within South Africa, I think it has been accepted now by government that tax levels are simply too high, and you don't want to negatively impact business even further as you go about the sort of attempting to turn the corner for the country. And I think that's what we've seen in this afternoon. But once again, government really has to come to the party when it comes to efficiencies of delivery. It's cut many of its budgets for certain key departments, I might add as well, which won't go down well among certain ministries in South Africa. And the minister will have to sell the cuts to the unions. He's going to have to sell the cuts to various state departments as well, particularly human settlements, I might add. And he's got a tough task ahead of him.
We're going to have to watch. Daniel, so thanks very much for giving us that commentary before and immediately after the budget. Political and economic analysts, there's some serious proposed budget cuts. Let's get some political reaction now. Vuyo Mvoko is standing by.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much, Devon. Well, Pulemabe, from the ANC, no surprises for you, really, because one would imagine that from your Lekgutlas and January 8th statements, all of those processes fed to what we had today.
Well, of course, Vuyo was actually talking to my colleague here, the head of the presidency, Comrade Besani, that one, our expectations have been met. The fact that there's great relief for the poor, there is no increase on VAT, there is no increase on corporate tax, and a number of other interventions that have been announced, including dealing with water security, dealing with energy security as well, making sure that we increase investment in our shores, which is quite critical to be able to secure the future, make sure that we lower our GDP ratio so that we can effectively deal with inflation. I mean, if you look at the forecasting, that over the next 2-3 years, you should be going to about 5.7 or so. Again, create the creation of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, establishing the state bank, which will effectively assist the unbanked in this country to make sure that they are part of the mainstream. All of these interventions are necessary, but again, the introduction of the carbon tax is a step in the right direction, especially when we move towards a low carbon transitioning economy. Those things are necessary to deal with all the mitigations that we have agreed to. The fact that there is also an increase on the plastic levy. This will make sure that we encourage our people to lessen the use of plastic bags, protect our landfill sites and all of that. So there's quite a lot that has been announced, funding towards the innovative university in Ekurhuleni. This means that the things that the president pronounced on during the State of the Nation's address
we're still not going to create as many jobs as we want. The economy is still not going to grow to the extent that we would want it to, given where we are right now.
Well, the fact that we are going to turn South Africa into a construction site means that we are going to create jobs. Look at what we're going to be doing in Lanseria. When you start, you're going to have to create jobs because you'll have to build houses, make sure that you connect effectively the province of Gauteng and the province of the Northwest. What you'll be doing as well in the Vaal through the smart city and all other interventions, the work that is going to be happening throughout the country, all of those things are going to create the necessary relief, make sure that we create the jobs that we need.
And you and I will be back here in February next year. We'll see whether indeed you will deliver on those.
We're going to change and start doing monitoring when we talk about these things. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. The ANC's Pulemabe on what the governing party thinks of what one of its own had to say. Let's quickly come to the IFP. Your thoughts on what the finance minister had to say today?
Well, it's been a very difficult line that he's been trying to maneuver here. It's not a pro-poor budget, and I don't think he said anything that's going to stimulate the economy. except for a few cosmetic changes, there's nothing much that he said, but we understand where he is. He could have said more about the state-owned enterprises and be more upfront in saying, well, we are going to privatize or semi-privatize, bring in business partners and bring income into it. But by saying we're going to bail them out, we've been hearing that over and over again. We're extremely concerned about the fact that there's going to be significant cutting in social expenditure, particularly in education, health and social grants as a collective. Because these are the areas which become the safety nets for our communities. However, having said that, I think the positive side is that taxes have not increased. Corporate taxes will not go up. We still, need to know how they are going to deal with corruption, because there's so much of leakages in government that we as the IFP believe that we have sufficient money in the kitty, but the money is not being spent wisely. And in his speech, one sentence said we need value for our money. We need to see how we're going to get value for that money.
You don't think the changes that have been brought about in the NPA, the changes at SARS and at several other state law enforcement agencies will make a difference?
Well, we hope it will make a difference. If you look at the additional investigators and prosecutors, we already know that there are 700 prosecutors short. So to say that we can have another 200 prosecutors doesn't solve the problem. We need to ensure that if justice is carried out, it must be swift justice. Justice delayed is justice denied, particularly in the area of corruption, where there's the biggest leakage of taxpayers' money.
Okay, we'll see how that goes. Let's quickly bring Jordan Hill-Lewis from the Democratic Alliance. Your thoughts?
Hello, hi, Vuyo. Look, what are the things that we welcome? We really welcome that there was no tax increase, no new taxes, and in fact slight income tax relief for consumers. That's great news. That's pro-growth. That helps you and I and all of your viewers in our pockets. That's good news for the economy. We also welcome the tough talk on the public sector wage bill. That's what the economy needed. That's what Moody's needed to hear. The question remains, Vuyo, can it actually be delivered? Because, of course, it's a number in a budget, but it hasn't yet been negotiated with the public sector unions. And that is the very big if. Can it actually be delivered? That remains to be seen. If it not, then the minister has a credibility problem.
Well, in fact, the Minister of Public Enterprises will be speaking to Devon Murugan in a short while to answer some of those questions. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to your participation in the debates that are going to follow. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks very much indeed, Vuyo. So we're going to get to the Minister of Public Enterprises in a moment, but I want to bring in Judge Dennis Davis here for a second. So people will be going home this afternoon knowing very well that there are no major taxes that's going to hit them, no income tax, no VAT. Is that pleasing for you, or is there a broader tax story this afternoon?
If you look at the broader implications, what is being bet upon is by keeping tax constant effectively and running a somewhat substantial deficit on the budget, that somehow we're going to grow our way out of trouble, which is the way we have to do that, and then you'd get more tax collection next year and you wouldn't have to cut. Your difficulty is that they've budgeted for only, I think, 1.1% in the following year, which means next year we're going to be back with the same problem. You've really kicked the can down the road, unless a couple of assumptions work. Number one, that they really are able to cut the public service wage bill, and number two, tax collection improves. If that does, then you might well be able that his assumptions may then have worked. Yes.
There was a very brave move in certain quarters on tax, though, wasn't it?
No question about it. It was a brave move, and maybe that was the only move we could have taken under the circumstances. Yes.
Judge Dennis Davis, thanks very much indeed. I want to call in the Minister of Public Enterprises very quickly, Praveen Gordon. Minister, thanks very much indeed. Do you want to explain to us how you see this 16 billion rand towards SAA? What does that mean?
Well, partly there's a debt to pay off, about 9.2 billion rands, and partly when you get into business rescue, you have what I call restructuring costs, whether it's leases, creditors, tickets outstanding for payment, and of course, if there are retrenchments, and in terms of the labor laws, then there's retrenchment costs as well. So, and there's fees that you've got to pay for the business rescue practitioners. They bring in all sorts of consultants, so you've got to pay them as well. So that's the package. But the more important thing is that the business rescue plan is beginning to emerge. We're working at it. We are a stakeholder, so we make whatever contribution we can, but we're also the funder of the process.
Yeah. So you use the word contribution, but Minister, the narrative sometimes out there saying that, it's interference, not contribution. How do you see that?
No, we must get rid of this interference idea. If we don't do things, then you hold us responsible. If we do things, then we interfere. We can't have it both ways. So our responsibility, in the case of SAA, we have the Companies Act and you have the PFMA. In terms of the PFMA, a minister is an executive authority. In terms of the Companies Act, the business rescue people are responsible for the airline. So you've got to work out the cross-match, if you like, between the Companies Act and the PFMA. And there has to be accountability to Parliament, for example, for public money that SAA or its business rescue practitioners will be spending as well. So there's not a question of interference. What do we all want out of SAA? We don't want public money wasted. We don't want an airline that just collapses. You want something that will be viable at the end of this process, which is why you put it into business rescue. The rescue means you want to shift it from an insolvent state or a distressed state to a viable state. And that is why we use the word restructuring. And so that's the restructuring process that the practitioners will tell us about as we go on.
Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. They want a stable state with SAA. That's the word here. Vuyo, back to you.
Thanks, Devon. While we keep on, we continue to hear from the people who will actually be debating this budget speech that Minister Tito Mboweni delivered today. And joining me now is Cope Willie Matisha. Your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I believe basically there are no major changes. All that we have is that which was given last year is actually a repetition. Moody's, for example, put us at about 0.7%. Now the minister here talks about the growth of 0.9%. Now if you look at that, it means, according to him, we'll go up by 0.2%. And if you then look at the unemployment rate, you look at poverty, you look at all these things that we face, it basically says there is nothing. But secondly, you look at the offshore investments. Lots and lots of our resources, platinum, gold, everything goes to China, for example. Now that is not looked at. Taken to China, they produce cars, they produce all these things, and when that comes back, that which comes back is extremely, extremely expensive. Now that adds again to joblessness, to the problems that we face. But above all this is the issue of energy. It's extremely expensive. President last year and even in the last SONA promised that we will get improvement and so on. But nothing.
It's up to you as members of parliament to hold him to account when he comes here for questions and when his ministers come before the various portfolio committees.
We basically are going to do that, and I can tell you that we will be able to rise and say, you said energy, for example, will improve, but then look at what is happening. Manufacturing, mining, the cars cannot move around, no houses, as a result of this thing that we have given. Therefore, we're faced with a major problem, and this budget has not taken us anywhere.
We'll see how the conversations go inside that chamber behind us. Let's hear from the FF Plus now. Doc, your initial thoughts?
Well, firstly, I think everybody is relieved that personal income tax and VAT has not been increased. But if you look at the overall situation, the picture is still bleak. For instance, if you look at the shortfall, the budget shortfall, it increased to 6.8% of GDP. And as well, as you look at the gross debt of the government, increased to about 65.6% of the GDP. Now, that is a very bad situation as far as debt and finances are concerned. And still, the government says that they will do anything to ensure that Eskom survive. We agree Eskom must survive. But we are worried that he did not close the door on the government employees pension fund. That door is still open. And we say he must be honest towards the government officials, whether they're going to use that fund or not. As the other SOEs are concerned, we look at SAA, we say they could have closed SAA down and privatized it. And we also say that if you look, instance, for the fuel levy, everyone who's using petrol is going to pay. So it's one step forward but 2 steps back. Lastly, we say that we can't understand that we are in a very bad situation where the government spending and its finances are controlled, but still they continue with the luxury of a state bank and a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have the money to pay our debts, but we want to get money for that. That's not accepted for the Freedom Front Plus.
Let's hear what the AC, your colleague from the ACDP, has to say. You will be having conversations with him in those committees. In fact, inside the chamber when you debate this this budget speech, and later on when you deal with the nitty-gritty of it all in those portfolio committees. Thank you very much for your time. From the SADP side?
Lovely to chat to you. Well, from our side, I think that most people are still concerned about the government debt levels escalating, the budget deficit of 6.8%, and so we've got to cut expenditure. And we, from the ACDP side, we're very pleased that the Minister has followed our advice last year in the medium term. We said if you give the National Prosecuting Authority and the Special Investigating Unit more forensic powers, more money, they'll be able to collect more money. And so there's 2.4 billion rand that has been given to them, and we're really hoping that people will be locked away who were involved in corruption, who were involved in gender-based violence, and of course the monies that were stolen will be collected. That is very positive. The other positive thing, I think everyone is happy, personal income tax is not increased, VAT is not increased, but of course the fuel levy is increased, road accident fund is increased. The big elephant in the room is going to be the public sector wage bill. I think everyone does understand the 160 billion rand that needs to be saved in expenditure, but whether the unions will have an appreciation, whether they will come alongside that, needs to be seen. We'd encourage everyone.
I also appreciate the fact that the unions, the argument that they are making, that they're not responsible for the mess that state-owned enterprises are in.
Absolutely, and that is why we're concerned about the extra 16 billion that has been given to an insolvent South African Airways. We're concerned about the state of Eskom. I was involved in the Eskom inquiry. You remember that, and we recovered R1 billion that was lost there. So yes, I can understand their argument, but at the end of the day, it's a multi-pronged effort to try to sustain and to stop Moody's from downgrading us to junk status. We've got to stabilize our debt, and it doesn't look like that is happening in the short to medium term.
Thank you very much. Ngabayomzi, very quickly, your thoughts?
Well, the minister did a good job trying to walk on a tightrope because he's in a very difficult fiscal space. But the bottom line is there is no growth strategy in that speech. The priorities of government from where we're sitting are lopsided, where you are going to give 16.4 billion rands over the medium term to a failing airline SAA, while you only give a paltry 2.2 billion rands to small business development, which is SIDA. It makes no sense.
What would you have done?
No, obviously you do the opposite. Even this 60 billion rands out of the amount of money that's going to be saved from the public sector wage bill is going to be channeled towards failing SOEs. I think trade unions would be more amenable to a proposal that says out of the saving, a big portion of it will be injected into the economy so that the economy can grow. And once the economy turns, we'll be able to employ some of the people that we can't employ as a state at this point in time. The other issue is it should concern us as a great deal as a country that at this point in time we spend more money on debt service costs than we do on economic development or community development, and in the future we're going to spend more money on debt service costs than we will be able to spend on public health.
Okay, let's leave it there for now, but we look forward to hearing your views when these matters are debated inside the chamber. Ngabayomzi Kwangwa from the United Democratic Movement. Devon Murugan.
All right, Vuyo, thanks very much indeed. So the commentary continues on the economic front. I have with me Ian Williamson, the interim CEO of Old Mutual. I think it was a pretty brave budget this afternoon, and so are some of the analysts here. Does it go far enough for you, Ian?
I agree that it was brave. I think whether it went far enough is a tricky one. I think we don't have the level of consolidation in the debt ratios over time that I think we really need to be confident around the rating agency's response, for example. So I think, for me, the jury's still out on how that response will end. But I do think, on the plus side, first of all, very pleasantly surprised at the small amount of tax increases and in fact a bit of tax relief given back to consumers. I think that'll provide some relief to the need to grow the economy. And then on the other side, very brave decision I think on the public sector wage bill. And I think the risk is, can that in fact be delivered?
I want to convert that to two confidence charts here. The one is business confidence. When you get such bold moves going on and reflected in this budget, you might just get that 30-year, we're at the downscale of a 30-year business confidence level here, very low. And on the other hand, the tax moves could very well indeed stimulate demand. I mean, it could boost consumer confidence. So on both ends here, if all things being equal, you could see a lift in growth if you're looking at that factors alone. Do you think so?
Yes, I agree. I think what the minister was trying to achieve was exactly that. Is the tricky balancing act he has is the economy has obviously been really struggling. How does one stimulate a bit more growth and get a little bit more confidence into the system? At the same time, you can't afford to spend a whole lot more money. So that balancing act is incredibly difficult to achieve, and I think on balance, the minister did a great job.
Tell me, to what extent is this budget still in, let's call it, proposal phase, and to what extent is there a certainty element with this budget? Because very often the investors will argue, well, we've seen the intentions, we're not quite sure whether or not it will work out that way. One case in point could very well be the cut on public sector wages.
Yeah, I think that is a risk, but I think anything you did other than increase taxes was going to have that risk attached to it. And I do think there's a risk that investors sit on the sidelines and say, let's wait and see what actually comes through. And that, to me, that's possibly the biggest risk that attaches to this way of doing it.
On face value, I would imagine Moody's, who's the only ratings agency that's keeping us on investment grade, would look at the budget and say, well, there's some seriousness here, we might hold off on the cut. Is that too optimistic by me?
I think there is a view out there that might be the case. I really don't know. I find it very difficult to call. I mean, the truth is, current asset prices are largely pricing in an expectation of a downgrade. So to the extent there's some relief from that perspective, probably a positive thing.
What do you think about the 2.5 billion rand or so directed towards the NPA and other specialist crime fighting units? Again, this was a big issue brought up by investors saying we're not going to throw in money in a country that is so susceptible to corruption and crime. Is that symbolic for you, or is that a real move, you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really good move. I mean, obviously, the tools at the minister's disposal are really about funding. So the ball now moves to the responsible ministry to say, can you now execute on the funding that's been made available? Obviously, our really big societal issues are all around crime, unemployment, education, and healthcare. So one needs to see resources being allocated there. But ultimately, I think the minister's narrative around needing to ensure that we have a capable state where corruption is eliminated, wasteful expenditure is eliminated, that's where the proof of the pudding sits. The funding's there, the minister's done what he can, now it's up to his colleagues.
You're a bank, you want to get more clients, you certainly want more people to take out loans and help themselves out on the financial side. There were some very interesting tax or incentives mentioned around property, for example. To what extent does a person pay tax on a property for 1 million rand, for example? I mean, I think there was some loosening there. You think on that front might be a positive for more people getting active on the economic front?
Absolutely. Anything that leaves consumers with a little bit more in their pockets, reduces the burden around purchasing assets is helpful. And what this economy needs more than anything else is to see the GDP growth lift. That's the biggest lever that we have. And although the minister's forecasting 1% growth rate over the next 3 years, that's still pretty low. We'd like to see the growth rate lifting even more. But all those ingredients that you've already mentioned around confidence, foreign investor confidence, investment in the economy, investment in infrastructure are all going to play a role. And let's hope that our forecasts are now a little bit conservative on the growth side and we start to see a bit more positive.
It's interesting you talk about metrics, and I can end off with this, because when you look at the projections for debt to GDP, it's not a pretty picture. Our growth level forecast-wise, also not a great picture. So one wonders, you're lowering the taxes, or you've got an ease on the tax front in anticipation that the economy might be growing. I just don't see that forecast talking to the growth forecast. Does that concern you a bit?
I think it's partly, we've got some structural impediments. So we need Eskom to be fixed. We need reliability in the electricity supply. And some of those things are going to take time. So I think the forecasts in that way are quite realistic. What they're effectively saying is it's going to take 18 months or so to fix some of these things. And only once they're there and in place would you really start to see the kicker. The Minister did list his list of 6 things that are all, kick-starts for the economy, little kicks in the bum for the economy coming up over the next little while. If those all come to pass, it will also help.
Ian Williamson, thanks you very much indeed, Interim CEO of Nedbank. I want to bring in the SARS Commissioner, if I can, Edward Kieswetter. Thanks very much indeed, Commissioner, for talking to us. So, great picture in terms of many analysts are telling us here it's a bold, it's a brave statement this afternoon. As a SARS Commissioner, what do you think the mentions around this budget is? What stands out for you?
I think there's a few important things. The Minister was very clear this is not an austerity budget. Yeah. It's a reconfiguration of our spend to ensure that we reduce expenditure in areas of inefficiency or areas where we believe we need to slow down the growth, like labour, and increase expenditure in other areas of investment and seeding for the long term. But to do that when you have short-term revenue constraints is tough.
And you do, because the projections are not pretty on your side as well.
Not wrong. And we are in an economy that doesn't create for us the buoyancy and the liquidity that we require. That's driven by 3 things. And in there lies bad news and good news. We know that since the original estimate was announced, nominal GDP was around about 7%.
Yeah.
In the re-estimation for this current announcement, it's below 5%, it's 4.8%. So it's a significant drop in nominal GDP will impact, therefore, on revenue collection. But there are 2 other areas which often are just below the radar, which we are bringing above the radar and conscientizing all South Africans to.
Yeah, what is that?
The first is compliance levels have dropped. We've seen a proliferation of criminal activity, not just aggressive avoidance and tax planning. We've seen companies being created for the explicit purpose of defrauding the VAT system. We're investigating over 600 such companies.
But you were given R1 billion in October to do exactly that. How's that coming around?
No, the R1 billion was promised. The first installment will be paid in the next year.
Fair enough.
But we're already working with what we have. We can begin to do certain things. With elementary artificial intelligence, we've been able to raise 500 million rand just from third-party matching of data of individuals. So a huge thrust for us is building our capability in areas such as better use of data. And we've got enormous quantities of data that with machine learning and artificial intelligence we can extract so much more insights from. So those 2 factors. One, improving compliance levels is key, and that depends on us being able to present a credible threat of detection and response to it. And then importantly is rebuilding and restoring the institutional integrity of SARS, and that's an important project that keeps us busy.
Edward Kieswetter, SARS Commissioner, thanks very much indeed for your time. Vuyo, that's back to you, the SARS Commissioner, actually liking what's happening with the budget, but says criminality as far as SARS tax collection is concerned, a huge problem.
Well, Devon, from what the Minister told us, the current electricity shortfall will ease as Eskom finishes critical maintenance. One person who should know how far they have gone with that is, of course, the interim chairperson, Professor Molakapuru Makhoba. Prof, are you on track?
We are very much on track. We have a plan that we have agreed with the executive management of Eskom, and I think we are going to deliver exactly what the Minister of Finance has requested us to do and the President.
Well, some people are talking about a year, some 18 months. The Minister of Energy was talking about 2 years. What are the timelines?
Well, we estimate it will be 18 months. But as I say, we have a plan with defined objectives defined timeframes and defined ways of monitoring and making pronouncement to the public so that we are transparent all the way. I think what we are trying to do is to provide the country with predictable and reliable electricity that will stimulate and encourage, I think, the economy to grow, as the Minister of Finance has indicated and requested Eskom to do, to provide reliable electricity to the country.
How will you ensure that you deliver on that promise you've made that you will do this within 18 months? Remember, promises have been made before, and those promises were not honored.
Well, it is true that some promises were not, we couldn't live up to all the promises, but this has required the inputs of several task teams of experts to give us some predictions based on the modeling that they've had, and we've had robust discussions with them. And I think we all agree that what we have planned as maintenance philosophy can be achieved within 18 months. And within that 18 months, we can predict, I think, the amount of electricity that we can supply to the country and what we will be doing where, and we will be able, I think, to inform the country at every stage as to what we are doing so that I think we can account.
Of course, I mean, you are dealing with a patient that's in ICU, and you are a medical doctor, so you would know that better than most of us. But what else from this sick patient is still giving you sleepless night?
Well, I think the problem about Eskom has been that lots of ideas have been on the table. None of the ideas were ever implemented or acted upon. We now have taken all those ideas, put them together, and like a typical doctor, you listen to a history, you make a diagnosis, and then you prescribe treatment. We have put all those ideas together. We have made the diagnosis which we believe is right. It has been confirmed and improved on by the presidential task team, by the ministerial task team. All these task teams and ourselves have sat together with the same facts to analyze and enhance them. We now think we have what it takes and what it needs to improve Eskom. What needs to happen in South Africa, like in so many things, is to actually act and implement that which we know we should do, and be bold about it and unashamed about it, so that we can save the country, save the economy, and save the nation of South Africa.
We hope that your board and the executives at Eskom will do exactly that. Thank you very much for talking to us. Professor Maleka Purumakova, who is, of course, the interim chairperson of the Eskom board. Devon?
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Vuyo. So you heard the announcement on the public sector wage bill cut. We have the minister saying about 160 billion rand to be cut from public sector wages. At least that's the proposal. I have Matthew Parks from COSATU here with me. Geez, if I had to choose a winner or a loser, on face value, you'd be the loser, Matthews. Have I got that right?
Yes, you've got it right completely. We view the budget statement as basically an attack upon workers' right to earn a living wage. The minister was silent about the fact that we lose 10% of our budget to corruption and wasteful expenditure. That's about 150 billion rand a year. Yet they want to get that money out of public servants' wages. Public servants don't earn much money. The average wage of a nurse is about 200,000 rand. And they're looking for a lazy, easy scapegoat. They're not addressing the wasteful expenditure or the corruption. They're not addressing the collapsing of the SOEs. They haven't even looked at increasing taxes upon the rich or looking at tax loopholes that could be plugged. They failed to come with a stimulus economic plan to grow the economy, to create jobs. The only thing out of this budget is to say we want to squeeze public servants. And the way they've done it is in a very reckless and dangerous way. We've been having engagements at the Public Service Bargaining Council about how to address the wage issues for the next 3 years.
Can I ask you then that this couldn't have been a bombshell drop? You would have had consultations about this.
It was a bombshell drop because yesterday they went to the Public Service Bargaining Council and said they want to withdraw from the existing 2019-2020 wage agreement. And that's a collapse of negotiating good faith. It's an act of actually extreme provocation. It's basically telling us that government's agreements are not worth the paper they're printed on. We had made compromises for this year's wage agreement. It is the lowest wage agreement in 11 years. Now they say they want to walk away from it, and they really want to just shift the blame to public service. So for us, it's making engagements very difficult because we don't know if we have a partner who is willing to negotiate in good faith at all.
Yeah. So is this in proposal phase? What happens from this point of view? I would imagine you've got a few members ringing up your cell phone and saying, what is this? Is that what's happening?
Yes, our members are very angry. From yesterday when government went to the Public Service Bargaining Council out of the blue and said they want to withdraw, they want to collapse the agreement, our members are furious. And it's difficult to sell compromises to members when they say, well, look, we're willing to save Eskom, for example, as COSATU. We're willing to put money on the table to help save the most strategic economic asset in the country. Members are now saying just, oh, so you're willing to assist government, but government is not returning the favour. They're basically slapping you in the face, and they're not addressing the fundamental crisis in the state, which is corruption and wasteful expenditure.
I want to talk about that. So just fit this in, this cut on the wage bill as proposed by the Finance Minister today, with discussions on the assistance with pensions directed towards Eskom. Did that feature as one conversation or not?
We had gone to leadership of the ANC and the Alliance and government in early November last year, after we saw in the October budget statement that there was no plan from government to save Eskom, the SOEs, the state, the economy. We proposed concrete proposals on everything, from Eskom to the SOEs to the wage bill, the state. Government failed to take it seriously. ANC is so dysfunctional, truly else they failed to take up the offer seriously, and has now put us in a very difficult situation. It's really restricting our space to negotiate, to compromise, and it's basically putting the gun to our heads and seeking to mobilize the public against workers and against unions, somehow to make us the scapegoats for the failure of leadership in government and the ANC.
Am I exaggerating if I say that it reminds me of a Prime Minister somewhere up north in the early 80s that may have had a similar posture? Is that an exaggeration?
Look, I don't know about that. Our assessment of how government and the ANC works right now is extremely dysfunctionality. It's a question of lethargy, not realizing how difficult the economy situation is. And as our members who are facing retrenchment at SAA, at SABC, at Denel, at Eskom potentially, across the private sector. So we're really disappointed how government is very lethargic on issues and not dealing with it with the seriousness it deserves.
Having said that, Matthews, I mean, there's still potential space and time to sit down with government on this one, is there not?
Look, we have to engage, and that's the job of unions and COSATU, is to engage and to find a compromise, find a solution. From our point of view, we won't accept retrenchment of workers. We'll defend their jobs. We won't accept the salaries to be cut. We'll defend that. We've got concrete proposals on how we can address the crisis, including along the wage bill. We think there's space to reduce what ministers earn, what director generals or managers earn. There's space to reduce the excessive bloated management structures in the parastatals. We think you can put the parastatals, the SOEs, under the Public Service Bargaining Council. That can help provide a lot of reduction in the wasteful expenditure. Equally, we think there's space in the public service vacancies to fill critical frontline service delivery posts like nurses and teachers, doctors and police. So we think there is a common sense approach to do with it, and you can do it over 3 years, so you can address the fiscal crisis without undermining workers' right to a living wage, without undermining public service delivery.
Well, you'll get government or perhaps Treasury arguing that, one, we are tackling corruption, and you can see that in the 2.5 billion rand that we're throwing to the NPA and other specialised units to fight exactly that. On the other hand, we've also got some tax incentives, if you like, but that's pushing it. Perhaps we didn't raise the tax rates, so the workers themselves are actually having a sort of a better environment than they anticipated on that front, at least.
Look, on the tax issue, I think we are quite pleasantly surprised that VAT was not increased. I think we must applaud government for not succumbing to the pressure to increase VAT, and also they've given tax relief on a personal income basis. I think that we must commend government for. That's some welcome relief. But we think that, look, the fiscal crisis is so great, they could have increased income tax for the rich. They could have looked at taxing or plugging some of the tax loopholes. We would have wanted to see them also dealing with SARS' capacitation issues, to invest more in SARS, to deal with the tax evasion issues, especially on customs enforcement. So on that point of view, we appreciate the relief for workers, but we felt they could have squeezed the rich a little bit more, given the fiscal crisis we face.
Matthew, I'm just going to go outside of the budget for a second here, and let's just go back to the proposal of using those pension funds to rescue Eskom. Exactly what can we expect on that? What phase are we at in that particular that particular issue?
Look, our position on Eskom is that it's not just about the 44,000 workers at Eskom's jobs. It's about all 60 million South Africans' jobs. It's about all of our pension funds. If Eskom collapses, we'll have no economy. So that's why we offered a decisive proposal to save Eskom. We're making very good progress around the negotiations. We've received fantastic responses from government, from business, from other labour federations. It'll still take a few more weeks to come to conclusion, but we're very optimistic, and we have to do it. There is no greater crisis than Eskom. And if we can tackle the crisis in Eskom, we can then begin to do other crises facing the state, facing the economy, and so on. And if we think it's a useful engagement, we actually have been quite pleasantly surprised about how business, for example, has responded to our social compact model and how they're willing to contribute towards saving it.
COSATU's Matthew Parks, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Not a very happy union at the moment there, Vuyo. COSATU telling us exactly what they think of those proposed cuts in the public sector wage bill. Vuyo, back to you.
Well, thanks, Stefan. Well, the minister says that 426 billion rands has been allocated over the MTF to local government. We all know the problems facing local government currently, and here to talk to us about that, just his initial thought, is of course the chairperson of Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Lots of money going to municipalities. We know the problems that many, if not most of them, continue to have, and also their defiance, of the Auditor General, who keeps on raising issues with municipalities not attending to those issues.
That is precisely the South African reality, because for the longest of time we lament that there's no money, only to find that there is money, but the systems in place to manage those funds are absent. So what we are concerned about is the continuation of the throwing of financial solutions to non-financial problems, or where you are injecting money, not doing first things first, of actually making sure that there's adherence to the law, in particular the MFMA at municipalities. And just to make an example, yesterday we had the Joe Morolong municipality briefing by the AG, a municipality that has received a disclaimer, and things keep getting worse within that disclaimer as well. But that municipality is bound to be getting money moving forward. And so the minister will really need to exert maximum pressure on national COGTA generally, but the provincial COGTA specifically, insofar as their oversight and ensuring that the interventions of 139 amongst others actually cater also for financial management. So whilst local government remains the most important sphere of government, because that's where services take place, there needs to be an added focus to ensure that we strengthen oversight. And from a SCORE perspective, we'll also have to ensure that MPECs are functional, and that is why the Speaker must move with the necessary speed to beef up the capacity of APEC so that oversight is strengthened within that space.
Now, the minister also mentioned how they are going to put systems in place to make sure that some of the highly inflated salaries of executives of SOEs are going to be curbed, and there's going to be regulations in place to make sure that that doesn't continue. Your thoughts, is that going to help?
It will help, particularly if you look at Eskom, which is very top-heavy in terms of management. So you do, besides, containing the salaries, they need to be radical and serious employer cuts at Eskom at the management level, at the very top. We've got too many executives in some of these airlines, so it shouldn't just be about containing the salary scopes, but it move further, cutting the wage bill by actually having people more of those bases. So we think that it's the step in the right direction, but also at the same time, how do you do that when we have not completed the assessment of how Eskom is going to be restructured? So those are also noble ideals in a vacuum.
We're going to leave it there. Of course, the chairperson of SCOPA talking there about financial accountability. We're going to go to Devon now for more reaction.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Vuyo. So with me, Nedbank CEO Mike Brown. I was chatting to you earlier, Mike, and I said this could be regarded as a politically brave budget announcement. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, I think it's a budget that shows just how much pressure the real economy is under. 0.3% GDP growth for 2019, 0.9% for 2020. These are extremely low levels of growth by any standards anywhere in the world. And when growth is that low and slow, what does it mean? It means corporate profitability is under pressure. It means individuals' take-home pay is under pressure. And that means there's less tax revenue for government. So there's been a big drop in government's projection of tax revenues. And what they've sought to do in this budget is try and claw some of that back through expense savings, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But the real trick is going to be, can we actually deliver on what has been said about expense savings? Can we really get 260 billion rand of expense savings in relative to what we were previously expecting? And then I think the other important thing is to realize that that's the right thing to do in the short term. But over the long term, the only way to get our deficits and as a result our debt trajectory into anything near a sustainable trajectory is through higher levels of GDP growth. So while in the short term we have to focus on expenses, over the longer term we've got to focus on those things that can cause the economy to grow faster. And here it was great to hear again affirmation about Treasury's paper on the strategy to faster levels of economic growth.
I was going to bring that up because there were elements of business confidence boosts here or there depending on how you digest it. Ease of doing business, one of the things, two things mentioned there. Corporate tax, looking forward, a suggestion that it could come down along with some incentives. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I think, just have a look at, whether you like it or not, the recipe for growth in America right now. A big piece of that is as a result of lower corporate tax rates, driving more competitiveness in an economy and as a consequence, driving higher levels of GDP growth. I think it's, very difficult to do in the short term given that we're still running 6 to 7% fiscal deficits. So, absolutely over the medium term, that has to be something to start leading to high levels of GDP growth.
Mike Brown, Nedbank CEO, thanks very much indeed for chatting to us. Well, there you have it for you, a perspective on the positives and negatives of this budget. Largely, got to say, it has been some brave moves for you.
Well, interesting indeed, and even on the political side, political parties seem to be giving him the benefit of a doubt, saying the finance minister didn't really have much room, to maneuver. Let's say if Hanif Hendricks from the Al-Jama has to say. Your thoughts about the minister's budget?
No, I think the minister did a fine balancing act, everyone's interest and the different factions in the ANC. That is lots of balancing to do. I think the Minister of Police must be very happy that he's getting over R1 billion to appoint 1,000 detectives so that, they can deal with, for example, those that must be prosecuted as a result of the Zondo Commission. That will give a lot of confidence in South Africans that something is going to be done about corruption. So I think for that, the Minister must be complimented.
What could he have done or said better?
Well, what he could have done was he could have allocated more money to address gender-based violence, especially grants to NGOs. You can't depend on government departments alone to fight the issue. And I think the minister slipped up by not allocating funds to NGOs to address the scourge of gender-based violence in South Africa. And the president must be disappointed because the president is very concerned about gender-based violence. But if there's no funds, how are you going to address it?
Hanif Hendricks, that's where we're going. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your time. He is, of course, the president of Al-Jama, one of the parties represented here in the National Assembly. And with that, from me and Devon, it's over to you in Johannesburg. Tembegile.